Today's speaker, Cheryl Chen. So I met Cheryl. She was teaching in Chile, and I found out that she has some really interesting views on game design. She's a PhD candidate right now at UCSC, and she basically explores how we go through narrative through interactive media. And she's a musician as well. So she's a very, very interesting person. She's a great educator. Her students love her, and it's my pleasure to introduce her to you and to her talk.
My name is Cheryl, like Sebastian said, and I am going to give a talk. My talk is on intelligent narratives, the story that we tell ourselves through digital media. And what do we mean by digital media, right? That's like, we need to define our terms first. So we have here this idea of something interactive and or procedurally generated. And to unpack it even further, when we think of interactive, like what do we think of? So here's an example of some non-digital interactive things. We have like dinner mystery theaters and choose your own adventure books. We have live action role-playing games and even tabletop RPGs, right? Board games, of course, are also interactive. And the idea is there's like this feedback loop. So you're doing something and there is a response that comes out of the system that you're working within. Now, when we talk about something like procedural content generation, which is a term that in the AI community that gets talked a lot about in game research, we talk about really what we mean is, or at least what I mean is, I'm talking about a system that is utilizing artificial intelligence. So when we talk about artificial intelligence, and I've taught this, I've introduced artificial intelligence to a variety of students from a variety of different ages, from middle school all the way up to college level. And I always say it's like, it's basically, in a simplified sense, it's a way of getting computers to do what humans already do very well. So you think of areas like computer vision or natural language, that's like they present problems of which that humans already do and we take for granted oftentimes, and we try to teach the computer to do it, to perform the way we perform. So applications of this. So this sort of intelligence we can apply to authoring a story, right? Which isn't interactive. And that's a really important point to make, is that just because we're talking about intelligence or we're talking about procedural content generation, we don't mean that we're necessarily dealing with an interactive space. But if you're authoring a game, on the other hand, then that is interactive, because the whole concept of it being a game means that there's some sort of interaction going on, right? Versus like a computer that would generate a story, for example. A computer that's just like telling a story continuously, and you have no influence over what's going on with that story. And overall, with this, like kind of a generalization is, we're kind of just designing an experience. We're using the abilities of technology to kind of design an experience. So key terms, right? Interactive, where there's like a feedback loop, and then intelligence, where content and experiences are procedurally generated. And that's kind of the foundation. We basically want to indicate that these two are separate, but they're also very closely related. Now, the whole gist of my talk, it's basically, I was talking to my friend Haim, who's going to give a talk in a few weeks, and he said that, like, you know, when he thinks of a long talk, like a 45-minute talk, he likes to break it down into 3 15-minute talks. So I did the same thing. I followed his advice, and I broke it down into kind of these 3 questions. So first question is, where can we improve? And second question is, why are these improvements difficult? And finally, how can we make this easier? And this is just kind of like an open-ended question at the very end. I even break this down even further, right? So in our first section, I'm going to give kind of like how we can improve. It's kind of an introduction to narrative theory and how the vocabulary of which the people in the community talk about this stuff. And then when we go into why are these improvements difficult, I go into a little more technical detail. And then how we make this easier, we talk about some of the theoretical ways that we could be thinking about this problem. So this is where it all started. How many people, this was their first system, or how many people had this system even? So this is my, about 5 years old, I had a Nintendo Entertainment System, and this was the first game that came with that system for me. I loved the worlds that was presented to me, and my family wasn't necessarily well off, but this was my first computer. This is my first introduction to the world of technology and what computers are capable of doing. And it wasn't that game that really made a mark on me. It was kind of this game that opened up this idea that games can create this narrative in your mind. It can give you the ability to experience a world and be part of an adventure, right? I mean, you're part of an adventure as Mario, but not the same as in a game where you're actually like role playing. And so I was so captivated by these games. My Twitter handle is even like, this was my AOL name back when we had AOL, and then it became my Twitter name. And so it's like always stuck with me. I use it on my Steam account. I used it when I'm on Battle.net. It's just become a part of me, right? It's how influential these games were. And this game, more so than the other two, had the greatest impact because it's kind of like there's this sweet spot when you're 7 or 8 or 9, and you're just so like ready for meaning and more that the world has to offer. And so this game came out kind of around the time where I was most impressionable and had a lot of meaning towards that. So if we look at it, we had this game. This is from the first Final Fantasy, right? 1987, and then 1991 was the second one released in the U.S. And then you can kind of see 1997 is the famous, well-known game Final Fantasy VII. How many people have played Final Fantasy VII? Right? This is a very defining RPG that came out for PlayStation. And then 2009. And you see the difference, right? We have this comparison of how this game series has kind of evolved over time. But this is graphics. And if we use this kind of as a sense of, the times have been changing, I want to ask the question about, what about story? And wait, but before we even get there, like, what do we mean by story, right? And so I'm going to introduce a little bit on what that is. So maybe we don't mean story, maybe we mean narrative. And the question, of course, that you would ask yourself is, well, what's the difference if there is story versus narrative? So I looked at, in my research, I looked at, to gain an understanding of, like, narrative is not something that video games introduced. Narrative is something that's been around for a long, long time. All the way back to, like, ancient Greek philosophy, right, where Aristotle was talking about theater and rhetoric and things like that. So looking at narrative theory and literary theory, there's this concept, there's this breakdown. And so this is like one of the big takeaways from this talk, is understanding that there's been this breakdown, the very traditional breakdown of narrative. And we're not going beyond kind of the first, the narrative and then that first level. We don't need to go that far, but we just want to understand that narrative is broken down into two things. We have two things when we are talking about narrative, which is content and expression, or this idea that there is story and discourse. There is a set of events and facts, and then there's how we communicate those facts. And we'll revisit this again and again, because this is like the foundation of everything, right? Everything that we want to talk about, that we're interested in, this is kind of the foundation for it. So in modern, more like, concurrent or more contemporary literary theory, this is kind of a more recent book by H. Porter Abbott. And it talks about this kind of summary of narrative, where it is now and where it's been. And it also summarizes narrative as a representation of events or series of events. So there's this idea that there are events and there's representation, right? So who likes to see the movie version of books? And who likes to read the books better? Right? This is like this idea of representation. One is you're reading text, and the other one is you're seeing something being played out before your eyes. So the events are basically the facts and the DNA or the skeleton or the meat of what's going on. Discourse, to kind of just give like a brief introduction, there's like these components of discourse that narratologist Gerald Genet talked about, and he talks about things like the order in which things are discussed, the frequency that you talk about them, the duration that you spend talking about them, the voice, like how they're being expressed, and then the mood of which you're expressing it, whether you sound happy or sad. So if we were watching a speech being analyzed, like an Obama speech, right? Obama was just here on campus not too long ago, and you're watching Fox News analyze the speech versus like MSNBC, we understand that it's going to be like a different experience, right? Like they're gonna interpret things very differently. So that's another way of thinking about it, is that there's something that exists in the world, and then there's these multiple interpretations or ways of expressing it. Here's an example in our movies, when we're talking about books and movies, right? These are visualizations of 5 different movies. And so Lord of the Rings, for example, started out as a book and then became a series, a movie series. And here's just a way of representing that. So we have like these facts that are represented as lines and labels of these lines, and they mean something. And so when we read the book, it also is trying to represent these same ideas, and it means something. And when we watch the movie, it's also trying to do something very similar. This is from XKCD, very popular comic that you guys, probably everyone's seen before once or twice or more. So basics, experience, which is the narrative, right? Events equals events plus the presentation. There's this relationship between the two. There's these two components. And then there's all these other words. If you read through the literature, you'll see things like discourse and story and plot and narrative. And it's like the terminology kind of can be a little bit distracting, but we just need to know that there's narrative and it equals these two components, events and presentation. So we go back to this idea of like, well, how does this impact games, right? How are we doing in terms of how we can improve in these games? And the question is, why aren't we doing better? And maybe what we need to think about also, right? And from a commercial point of view, maybe we don't necessarily need games to be doing much better. Maybe they are doing great, and we don't need to be making these advancements. But we want to be able to still ask ourselves that question, right? We don't want to limit things just because we think that they're as good as they are. We want to be able to test things and find out for sure. So who's played Pokemon before? Anybody? And who's played more than one Pokemon game? And so the point is, for people who have not played Pokemon, is that it's kind of like it's a very similar kind of situation that you find yourself in every time. And this situation is you're a Pokemon master. You're aspiring to catch them all and become this master of Pokemon. And you travel through this adventure trying to find all the different Pokemon. And the story is actually quite similar with every game. I played the first one back in high school, and then like 15 years later I played another one, and it actually felt like the same game to me. But that's not to say that's a bad thing, right? We don't want to make any value judgments. This is making lots of money, and that is a good metric, and there's nothing wrong with that. But the question, and then there's another game that's similarly like kind of makes a lot of money off of like its intellectual property or just the kind of the design of it, is another game called Madden. How many people play Madden? Yeah, so this is a similar game that year after year they release a new Madden, they update the teams and the rosters, and so they're able to make money off of just kind of just basically just the general narrative, the real world narrative of football. And then going back to Final Fantasy, which is like personal favorite series of mine. We look who played Final Fantasy 13. Anybody? Some people played Final Fantasy 13. Who's played a Final Fantasy game before? A bunch of different people. So the question, one of the big questions that people have is like, how can we create a better experience, like story experience, where you feel like you matter? And we call this agency in the field. How do we feel like when you're a player that your actions actually mean something to the overall story? So in Final Fantasy 13, what they ended up doing is they created this very visually beautiful world, and it was on PlayStation 3, and what happened was, especially, this is just kind of the beginning, and it does open up towards at the end, but I'm just using this kind of like as an exaggerated example, that as you're going through these worlds, they all look very pipe-like. They're very tube-like, and they're kind of leading you through this experience, right? And you can imagine, if I was teaching this in a class right now, I'd ask, why would somebody want to do that? Why would that be a design choice? Well, basically, I mean, obviously, if you give people lots of options, you have to author all these options. You have to create this space where people can experience something meaningful and still have choices that matter. So if you end up wanting to kill like your best buddy at the beginning of the game, then all that story that involved your best buddy that could come later on just isn't even accessible. It's not even being used. And so the authoring burden isn't getting the payoff that may be optimal for the game. And so there's another game called Heavy Rain. Did anybody play that game? So Heavy Rain is this game that was aimed at creating this like very deep, profound experience of a father and his children, and just dealing with loss and dealing with kidnapping of his son. And in this game, it has 17 endings, I believe. This is kind of a morbid slide, so we'll kind of pass right through it. There's 17 endings, and what happens is it creates kind of like this. It sounds like there's a lot, but what happens is it kind of is very like broom-like, a broom shape. It gives you these options at the beginning, but it isn't until the very end that it gives all these like outcomes. So it's kind of trying to be creative with the authoring burden problem, right? Like if you wait till the end to present all these possible outcomes, then it doesn't have that exponential growth that it would if you tried to present that same kind of situation at the beginning. Can I get the time? So we've talked about where we can improve. And I introduced intelligent and or interactive, and then we talked about narrative equals events plus presentation. Next, we're going to talk about why these improvements are difficult. So first, I was going to introduce this game, this interactive drama, which is what Andrew Stern and Michael Matthias, the people who worked on it, called it. Has anybody seen Facade before? So not a few people have. It's definitely worth looking into because of what it. So. Here we go. Yeah. So Facade is kind of this idea of giving so that you saw the problem of like being led through a tube or kind of being on this as one developer said, like a glorified roller coaster ride. So here we have somebody, a team of people, a team of mostly like primarily is Andrew Stern and Michael Matthias working to kind of create a space where you have a scenario that presents the ability to kind of alter the outcome. In this kind of 15-minute experience, you're visiting your two friends who are married, and it seems like a casual visit at first. You don't really know exactly what the turnout's going to be, but as things go, the conversations get a little more heated, right? So you can see. I'll just kind of talk over it since it may not be that that audible, but they're like these characters are being managed by the game or by the interactions that you get to present through typing in natural language. So you're typing in what you would actually say, and then they understand it in some way, or the system understands it. And everything from like how they blink to how they move their face to where they are in the room, that's not being scripted. In traditional games, it's kind of easier to kind of set where these people will be and have it determined ahead of time. In this example, we see them, it's being composed dynamically as you go. What room they're going to be in, how they're talking to you, how they feel, things like that. And that was around 2005. So we had this came out around 2005, 2006. So the next question to ask would be, well, what's happened in 10 years? Well, 10 years, like from Michael Matthias's group, I think Josh McCoy is kind of the lead of this project, came out a game that was was nominated for technical excellence at the Independent Games Festival. It's one of a number, it's been acknowledged as being something that is trying to push technical innovation in games. And this game is called Prom Week. It's kind of a very Sims-like situation where you're trying to create social circumstances from high school students like leading up to the prom and all the different social dynamics that go on at the time. So it's again the sense of being dynamic or procedurally generated or kind of creating these moments. And you're given these goals to kind of meet and satisfy these social situations. So this is kind of like, these are two examples. I just gave you kind of two examples, right? Two examples of games. And we talk about, so these are games that were done for like research purposes. They're kind of like, they're artistic, they're experimental. There's a whole series of, there's a whole like community of people who are interested in experimental games. I believe Robin Huneke was talking about that last time I was here. And so the question is, why is this not seen more in commercial games? Like why don't we adopt them? And why is it that we, even in like more recent times, stick to kind of like these very tube-like, very linear structures, and we don't try to create these more dynamic, different experiences? I mean, in the graphics, we seem to be able to like easily get more realistic, but as far as like human experience, it seems to be like we want to stick to be more traditional and more linear. So why not more? In some of my work, I talk about authorial leverage. So I did a lot of work looking at this idea of, it's kind of an analysis and evaluation of AI systems, and it's particularly for narrative authoring. Authorial leverage is this idea that you can spend a lot of, you can take a lot of effort to create something that has quality, has variety and flexibility. And when we're saying creating something, we're talking about not a story, one story, but a space of possible stories, an interactive space or a generative space of stories. And to kind of define it even further, so we have this idea of quality, which asks the questions of, are the stories any good? Variety of the outcomes. So the space, is there a space of good stories? Are we getting a number of really good stories? And flexibility of the AI system. Can we change or grow the space? Or is all the work that you went into building the system like very dependent on the specific setup that you currently have? Can you grow it? Can you modify it? Things like that. And then finally, the effort of the author, which is, would it be actually easier to create the same experience without the AI system? And especially when you're dealing with like academia and industry, you get asked that question a lot. The industry wants to know, why would we try this more complicated way of doing things when we have our own way that we've been using for a long, long time? So that's a very good question, right? And so the looking at like whether we are benefiting, whether we're making a positive contribution, is a very important question to ask. So when we look at narrative authoring, right? Narrative equals events plus presentation. We're not just talking about like books and movies as they are, like traditional media. We're talking about like this idea of intelligent narratives. So what do we mean by intelligent narratives? Do we mean narratives written by someone intelligent, narratives that can be understood by intelligent people, narratives that are authored by intelligent technologies, or narratives that intelligently respond to human interactions, right? And there's this whole area called intelligent narrative technologies that kind of ask these questions, more so the last two that involve, you know, the focus on the use of technology. And here's an example of this is a micro tailspin done by Warren Sack. It's just a story generator. It's a story generator, and it's also interactive, so it's an interactive story generator. But it shows kind of like the logic and how a computer thinks about story. That it can create these like assertions about the world, right? Joe was near the cave. Joe knew that Joe was near the cave. And if you were reading this, if you were telling a story like this, it kind of seems like you would assume that if a person was near the cave, they might, if no one says anything, you might just assume that they do know. But that, to the computer, is not obvious. They could be near a cave and they don't know where they're at. They don't realize there's a cave there. And here's another example. So when we talk, again, we're talking about intelligent narrative technologies, we talk about this idea of like something intelligent existing inside the game world. So imagine like you're exploring a dungeon. And this system is called declarative optimization-based drama management. If you want the technical term, you can look it up on Google Scholar or something later. But imagine you're in a dungeon and you're feeling lost, and the system has the awareness of you. Like there's a player model. We call these player models, like a system's understanding of where you're at in the game. And so in the game, you seem to be lost, and the computer has the ability to act upon that. So the computer sends you a non-player character to give you the insight or the help you kind of break through the roadblock that you're in. And they might even throw in some story that makes sense for the moment that you're at, like in the circumstance, at the present time and space. So there's a monkey that's like, feels like he's being cheated, so he's gonna help you finish and escape the dungeon. And gives you a candle, and all of a sudden you have a candle now. Now this could, in traditional ways of achieving or like unlocking treasures, you would like go to kind of an area on the map, and it would kind of open up to you, and then you would find the item, and hopefully you wandered around not too long before you found it. But in this case, now there's something intelligent that's aware of you, that is managing the dungeon, managing the experience, and wants to help you tell a really good story. And here is a slide that has a lot of boxes and arrows, and in computer science, you end up spending a lot of your time looking at boxes and arrows and making boxes and arrows, and then trying to represent what you've just built or built something that is represented by these boxes and arrows. Here it kind of just is the visualization of that system. You have a drama manager, and then you have a game world. The player is within the game world. There's a bunch of events, and then here on the right side you have drama manager actions that the drama manager can do, like drop a note in the next room that you end up in. And then there's different plot points that happen to kind of help the system know what you've accomplished so far. And so we're asking the question, right? What are we managing? Are we managing drama because it is a drama manager? Are we managing experiences? Well, I mean, again, very vague, but what does that mean? We can't just tell a computer, look, tell a good story. You need to like formally define what that means. And we do that with what I mentioned just the previous slide. We do that with defining what plot points are. And this happens in the game Facade that I just showed you. It's like we have to break down story into these granular components so that we can kind of maneuver around them or maneuver them around. And this is what the plot points for that particular drama managed game look like. That game is called Empath. It was a system that I worked on early on in my research career. And we created these plot points where different plot points are grouped together by theme, and they're all part of a specific quest or subquest. And there are things that can happen that we can kind of translate into mathematics, right? We're turning these into numbers. We want to say, is the user, without necessarily asking the user, because that might disrupt their experience, we want to be able to determine, is the user lost? Is the user getting a good story? Is there like a lot of open-endedness in this game? And we can do that by kind of creating these sets and properties of these plot points and then calculating, running them through some function and calculating where they are, if they look like they're kind of jumping around from different places and different themes and different quests, whether the stories are being finished, whether they even know enough to complete a certain set of plot points. And so these plot points are kind of placed all over the map. This is the 5x5 version of the game that we tested. We tested it on about 100 people, and we kind of got their feedback on whether they could how they interacted with this intelligent narrative technology. And we would ask them questions like, were you able to see a chain of game events where one event caused another to happen? So we would test them first, and they would play through the game, and then we would do survey questions afterwards to kind of see if the drama manager was good at figuring out what was going on with the player and whether the player felt like their experience was overall being improved. Again, this however still comes into question, and yeah, we were able to create this experience and people were able to play it, but we still need to go back to this. We need to ask the question of, is there any leverage being gained from using an intelligent narrative technology or an AI system? Is it just as easy to author a game without using an AI system than it is to use one, right? And what we found out with trying to build this system is that you actually oftentimes come into conflict with quality of the story and the variety of stories that you want. So the more stories you want, the harder it is to have really good stories, right? And if you want one really good story, it's really hard to make more than that one really good story happen. And you see that's kind of why I'm kind of implying this is why in the industry it's harder to have this like epic adventure and then try to spin off lots and lots of variations that are at the same depth as a human could author, without the human actually going through and authoring it. And then as far as flexibility goes, like this system exists, but it still takes a lot of fine tuning and tweaking to even make it usable in another context or another story world. So again, this is the reminder of that. So some improvements can be made, of course. And we basically, that kind of concludes this idea of like, why are these improvements difficult, right? Because you're creating this AI system that's very hard to interact with. Sometimes it's hard to teach a computer how to author and how to make something make sense. In my AI work, when I work with logic, you oftentimes will need to do something like you need to get the magic ring, and then the computer system knows that one of the rules is you're allowed to trade things for the ring. So then the system can think of something really ridiculous, like you traded a rock for the ring. And it just seems kind of like dull, because why would you trade the rock for the ring? It's just a rock. Why was it so easy to get? Or you could say something like you traded your firstborn child for the ring, which may be a good story, but also may not make a lot of sense because that seems really extreme to trade something else that is like too valuable. So the computer needs ways of like, you have to like formalize all these conventions that human beings have that we take for granted. We just kind of assume that these are common sense things. And so kind of like the final part of the talk where I want to introduce like a way to make this easier, and this is kind of this is like where a lot of my work is headed towards, is kind of defining ways of redefining the problem, or finding ways of redefining the problem. And I like to start with this. Like, again, I said this is kind of a foundation. This is where a lot of the work is kind of focused on, this narrative equals events plus presentation. And we'll kind of look at this. Like, does this work? How does it work? How do we think about it? We'll use some examples, because examples are always good to help digest these theoretical statements. So we have this idea of, so we're going to look at narrative equals events plus presentation from the idea of when we're creating generative spaces, or we're creating these procedurally generated spaces, interactive spaces, there's a sense of variations. And I think that this idea that there are variations is a very important and very focal aspect of going towards interactive media and digital media. Because when we're dealing with movies and when we're dealing with books, we don't have as much of a sense of variations, right? So why not, instead of managing plot points like I showed you in the Drama Manager example, we manage things like variations. So here we go. Here's a couple games. Here's Final Fantasy VII and Planescape Torment, and we have here dialogue trees. So here's a managing of variations through dialogue trees. It's very like choose your own adventure-y, like what are you going to say next? How are people going to respond? How does that change the world? Then we have another way to kind of manage variations, right? So we're managing variations. We're looking at like having a drama manager, which is drama managers are using like search to figure out like probabilistically what's the best thing to happen next. And so that's kind of a more intelligent, more directed probabilistic model. You could also just have kind of a random probabilistic, like, as you're playing these like Final Fantasy-like games, there's some probability that you will encounter bad guys, right? And then Left 4 Dead is another game where there's a drama manager that's kind of that has a sense of where you are in the game and whether things are kind of in a lull or whether things are getting too exciting and you might be overwhelmed. And then here's another example of different variations, right? You have Phoenix Wright, this like lawyer game. And you can play it. It's originally in Japanese, but of course when they ship it in the US, they translate it to English. So you have these two different variations. And then movies, you also have the ability, or anime, you can like kind of watch it in different languages. And then remakes of games, right? If this is Final Fantasy IV as it came out in the US, and then this is a remake that they did later on of the game. And so the question is, when we're thinking about variations, these variations all have different implications. Like when you have a kind of like this tree-like structure, are you changing the plot or the discourse? That's like the foundation of this focus, right? This idea that narrative is events plus presentation. When you're here, are you changing the event? Or are you changing the presentation? And it's like I can see an argument for both. It's not that clear. When you're here, when there's like probabilistic randomness or a little bit of just kind of intelligent management of what's going on, is that a management of the events or the discourse? And then here, this one is clearly discourse, right? Because you're not really changing much of the story at all. It's kind of like the sliding scale that's kind of in this gray area, but this one's clearer than the other two slides. So what I want to point out with these examples is that emphasis is on causation when you look at narrative as events plus presentation. And so a new way to think about it, looking at some of the narrative theory, is that in one way, we could actually switch gears and think about emphasis on rhetoric, where narrative equals supplementary events plus constituent events. Here's an example of a variation, right? Who sees what's going on? Like the two different, it's all more or less just a wall of dots, right? We see what's going on here. But one of the dots is growing and shrinking. We see that? Yeah? And that's a variation. I think the experience overall is you're still staring at like a big screen of dots. And this variation may not be meaningful, which is important to identify, is that some variations just don't mean very much and maybe aren't that important. But what about this? Who likes eating apples? Anybody ate an apple in the last week? Yeah? An apple a day. Who likes eating an apple like this better? Who likes to cut them up? So there's a good number of people who would rather eat the apple cut up. My question to you is, what really changed in this? Like was it the presentation? Was it the constitution? Was it the apple? The apple itself is still just an apple. Right? But these two are very different experiences for some people. Some people actually would much rather prefer eating an apple like this. Some people, I don't know, maybe young kids, maybe kids won't want to eat an apple like this, but would rather eat apple nicely sliced up. And so we talk about emphasis on causation, emphasis on rhetoric. So here's some, just go through some examples, and we'll talk about some heavy AI systems, which I don't expect everyone to fully digest, but I'll just show them to you because they're really cool, and I think they're really neat ideas. But this is just kind of a very simple game example. You play these games. Anybody have a Mii on their Wii? Or if you've played The Sims or Rock Band or this Facebook game Pet Society, you get to choose your avatar. Now here's another question. When you're choosing whether your gender is male or female, are you making a change to the event structure or a change to the discourse? Like, I guess the problem that I want to point out is that even though that's the foundation of how we think about narrative, it's actually hard to apply to games because I don't even know whether this is like, whether your monster is blue or pink really affects the story.
Is that Michael Jackson?
Yeah, who knows? I kind of picked it because, kind of reminded me of Michael Jackson. Yeah. So to kind of look at like this idea of supplementary, we have impressions of causation. We introduce again, going back to the definitions of narrative, which even within narrative theory, they talk about how causation is something very powerful, but that there's also this other thing called rhetorical leverage. That's not just about causation, but it's also about the expression and what we mean and meaning. The meaningfulness of the variations. And then here is another book by Roger Schenck, a very famous language AI researcher. And he talks about how the storyteller is actually creating this kind of deceptive process where they're cherry picking events and facts to kind of convey or get the reaction that they're looking for from their audience. And Robert McKee, famous playwright instructor in LA, talks about how narrative is about, that title is wrong. But that there's encyclopedic possibilities, and the mark of a master is to select only a few moments, but give us a lifetime. And then H. Porter Abbott again goes back and talks about this is from the author point of view, from the audience point of view, that we can't even avoid underreading and overreading and normalizing this. And that's why the title of this talk is about stories that we tell ourselves. Here's another example. I think I'm running out of time. I'm switching in and out just to make sure that we're still on track. So here's a psychologist, Frederick Bartlett, who talks about, he tells like stories from Native American folklore to students at Oxford, and then finds them a year later and asks them to retell the story. And what he finds in this research or in this study is that people can't help but take things that they have no cultural context for and then fit them into their own personal understandings and belief systems. It's just, we can't help it. There's like this strong bias that goes on. And the question is, of course it's easy to kind of have this structuralist breakdown of narrative as, plots and expression, but we can't ignore the power of like human interpretation and how we relate to each other, how we relate to the world around us, and how we need to make sense of things. There's a lot of leverage that can happen if we look at these concepts, and we look at how one story can mean something totally different to two different people. And I think that's kind of one way to break down the problem. I'm not saying it's a better way. I'm just thinking, this way of doing it, we've tried it. We've seen how it's been hard. Why don't we think about it this new way, right? Like, we think about it as creators, we're providing the materials to enable our audience to tell themselves a story. And that in that, there's some authorial bias and there's some audience bias going on. And so instead of thinking this very like how do we generate a good plot, or how do we generate a good sequence of events, how do we make the causation very compelling, let's think about how do we take something that is already compelling and create meaning for their users and your audience. So here's an example. I actually have this with me. A few years ago, I went to Microsoft because they had a launch for Computer Engineer Barbie, right? And has anybody read the book or seen copies of the book that? Yeah, and so there's this copy of this book that talked about how Skipper's like, wow, Barbie wants to make a game, and Barbie's like, well, I can't really make the game. I need Steven and Brian to really do it for me. And okay, some people didn't like that because of just in context of the way we view stereotypes these days. Some people didn't like that. So then some people decided to rewrite it and give their own spin on it. So here's an example where Barbie sounds really well informed and that she's doing some of the coding, but she's also a good team player. So she'd be great for a startup someday when she gets there, things like that. my point in this, show you this, is that here we see the same image. We see the same art assets, and art assets are actually very expensive, right? To create these like huge, like beautifully rendered graphics, it actually costs a lot, and we don't want to make like lots and lots of these for all the possibilities that someone could want in a story world. We can actually take the same assets and kind of teach them to formalize the ways that meaning is portrayed. Here's another one, more. This is from the this is a visualization, I think, done by, I believe it was the New York Times or Washington Post, one of those news sites, where they kind of did like a interactive representation of the Ferguson incident, and you can kind of look through different testimonies. Like here's a different set of witness accounts, and it's kind of leaving it up to you to kind of figure out what you're going to do with these pieces. But again, it's kind of creating this interactive space to manage the story. Okay, to briefly go over these AI systems, this is like, I guess, a whole another talk in and of itself. But in the early AI started in like the 60s when they were like, oh, we have computers now, right? Alan Turing wrote about computers in the 50s, and then in the 60s we had computers, and we're like, now we can like create like we can recreate the human like functions through these resistors and capacitors. And early AI actually focused on this idea of like representing our understanding and meaning, things like that, through belief system. And this AI researcher Abelson defined the problem as a challenge to your belief system. So you have a list of things that represent your belief system. Could be religious, could be political, could be patriotic, things like that. And then you come into contact with challenges to these situations. Say you're part of a nation that does something really mean to another nation. What are the ways you can justify it without changing what happened? You can't change history, but you can change how it's told. And so Abelson created a bunch of rationalization mechanisms. We don't need to go through them specifically, but I can explain them later if you can email me, and I can send you the paper. And then a famous system designed by Michael Matthias called Terminal Time does kind of like this artistic installation in a movie theater where it retells history through documentary clippings, but with a computer-generated narration to kind of give a rhetorical spin on what's going on. So in one setting, you could have a very pro-communist retelling of the, I believe it was the 19th century, or you could have a very, pro-religious or anti-religious telling. And some people couldn't really understand the point of that. Like they would just see it and they would just be like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that this person believes history happened the way that they narrated it. But the point was that you can narrate it however you want. And at every break point, you would poll the audience to see what type of a bias you wanted to spin on the events of history. So just kind of like, this is kind of the last kind of the concluding remarks that I have about new ways of thinking about how we tell stories or how we formalize the process of storytelling. In narrative theory, they talk about an effect called the Rashomon effect, or like there's an unreliable narrative effect, where it's kind of just it's identifying this idea that there is a bias in the telling of stories, and it's based off of a movie, Rashomon, in 1950. And Rashomon is kind of this murder mystery, and it goes through murder mysteries and detective stories are really good at are a really good example of this, because you're taking the clues and the facts and you want to kind of make sense of it. So you're making sense of things that are true in a story world that you've already identified as being compelling and important, and you want to create a good story for yourself. So here's kind of a system that I worked on where I was assigning roles to say who was a victim. And so in a situation of a story, it's like you can kind of choose like, well, this person's clearly the victim. If you're in like a relationship dispute, you could side with like the one person or the other person, right? And it's like each side sees themselves as the victim a lot of the times, and which makes things very complicated. And you get these variations without having to change what the content of the, there needs to be not as much of a change to the whole plot structure, or less of an emphasis on causation and more about why and the meaning behind it. And so here's a kind of the formal, like a formal representation, again with the boxes and arrows. Here's some code that kind of represents how we formalize and we break it down into like predicate logic. break down this idea of input. So you declare these people, and then the output is that these things happen as a result. And so the question of this work, I guess, is asking, there's all these different kinds of variations. There's plot level, like causation-based variations. There's these rhetorical-based variations. And I'm just saying that, like, I think a lot of emphasis has been on the plot level. And why not think about other ways of managing these variations? And so here's another example of different people's interpretations, how people tend to have this bias about it. Again, causation and rhetoric. And yeah. LAM is my operating system. This is like, there's a win for making games inexpensive, I think, if we continue looking into this more deeply, where we can use the same assets over and over again and allow people to tell themselves different stories that mean something important to them or make them see something new that they didn't see before. So that's what we went through. These are the 3 things. Oh, here's a question. What color is this dress? So whose belief system is that this dress is white and gold? Raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And okay, everybody else sees what? Blue and bronze, blue and black. This is the actual dress. And apparently people see something different. So it is about the stories that you tell yourselves. All right, that's it. That's my talk.